Rich people are angry because they're supposed to be, because Trump is waging class warfare on behalf of the working class. Wall Street for the last 3 election cycles chose the Democrats. Like, that's not an accident. They hate what Trump represents. They love open borders. They love slaves. They love free trade. And they don't give a shit about the American working class.
Okay, but the stock market is more than rich people.
Batya Ungar-Sargon is here. She's a self-described MAGA lefty who's written a whole bunch of books criticizing the elite's betrayal of the middle class. She has her finger on the pulse of what the MAGA movement actually wants. Hi, Batya. Welcome.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here with you, Liz. I'm such a huge fan of yours, and I'm very excited for this conversation.
Let's start with this security footage of 30-year-old Rümeysa Öztürk. She was a Turkish doctoral student at Tufts. There was this footage of her being dragged off the sidewalk. We've got a little bit of that. Let's watch that. You roll it, John.
Anne kaçmıyorum. Anne kaçmıyorum.
Yeah, there she goes. Okay, and now I just want to listen to Secretary of State Marco Rubio. So she's been charged with no crime, as far as we know. She wrote a pro-Palestine op-ed in the school paper. She may have participated in some of the protests against Israel. I want to just roll Secretary of State Marco Rubio's justification for this, and then we can talk about it. Let's play that.
We revoked her visa. It's an F1 visa, I believe. We revoked it, and here's why. And I'll say it again. I said it everywhere. Let me be abundantly clear, okay? If you go apply for a visa right now, anywhere in the world, let me just send this message out. If you apply for a visa to enter the United States and be a student, and you tell us that the reason why you're coming to the United States is not just because you want to write op-eds, but because you want to participate in movements that are involved in doing things like vandalizing universities, harassing students, taking over buildings, creating a ruckus, we're not going to give you a visa. If you lie to us and get a visa and then enter the United States and with that visa participate in that sort of activity, we're going to take away your visa. And once you've lost your visa, you're no longer legally in the United States, and we have a right, like every country in the world has a right, to remove you from our country. So it's just that simple. I think it's crazy. I think it's stupid for any country in the world to welcome people into their country that are going to go to your universities as visitors. They're visitors. And say, I'm going to your universities to start a riot. I'm going to your universities to take over a library and harass people. I don't care what movement you're involved in. Why would any country in the world allow people to come and disrupt? Now,
okay, Batya, all of us, I think, have been critics of aspects of the campus pro-Palestine left. We've certainly criticized the tactics of shutting down libraries and walkways. But do you have a problem with how far this has gone already, where we're removing people for writing op-eds or taking away their visas for writing op-eds and basically participating in campus protests?
Do you disagree with anything that Marco Rubio said about it being sort of nuts for a country to invite people in, learn that they then plan to engage in certain activities that we as a country have decided, I mean, the polling is near unanimous on this, is unacceptable, and then consider that to be sort of like dishonestly representing themselves in their visa, like to do you disagree with anything that Marco Rubio himself said just in that clip?
I think that it's like, what are the certain activities? If the certain activities are writing a certain opinion piece and engaging in a protest that there's aspects of it I don't like, then no, I think that we should have a wide berth there. If there's evidence that she's actually engaged in property destruction or some sort of actual crime, then that's a different conversation. But none of these receipts are being released or put forward. So it's hard for me to evaluate exactly what Rubio's saying there.
I've been thinking a lot about this because initially, when I read about the Mahmoud Khalil case, which we can get into, I think is actually much clearer than this case. Certainly, the evidence that's been
Hmm.
presented seems much clearer. At first thought it was an obvious free speech case. We know that the Supreme Court has upheld the free speech rights of green card holders. Um, I then thought about it more. I found out more. I think a lot of us were being exposed to the evidence as it was coming out. We saw the footage of him handing out pro-Hamas, actually Hamas generated propaganda, and we saw clips of him defending the right to armed resistance of Palestinians, which unfortunately, in every single instance in recorded history, has involved terrorism because it does not distinguish between civilians and militants. Um, I started to think to myself, well, is this really a free speech question or is this an immigration question? I think I held on to the free speech thing because I didn't want to see myself as a hypocrite. So I for a long time resisted the idea that it was an immigration issue. We then learned that he potentially had lied on his visa. Certainly, he left off that he had worked for UNRWA, which is the branch of the UN that targets Palestinians and which the United States deemed so closely tied to Hamas under the Biden administration that they defunded it. And that he lied about having a high security clearance with through the British government through his work. I think it was in Beirut. So that's a very clear cut case. This is a person who lied on his visa, left things off that would have resulted in the denial of a visa. Obviously, this is grounds, easy grounds for revoking his green card. There is also a statute that allows Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, to immediately revoke the green card or visa of anybody he deems to be a national security threat. Now, do I think these people are a national security threat? No, I think that's an embarrassment to the United States to suggest that anything that comes out of the mouths of these people would threaten us. But that's not the legal question. The legal question is, does Marco Rubio consider them to be a threat? What is his, the theory of mind of Marco Rubio? If he deems them a threat, he is in his legal right to revoke their visas and deport them. Now, I do want to say, I think there's a distinction here between the legal case and the moral case, and we can get into them. I think that's the question we should discuss when it comes to this woman who wrote the op-ed. It seemed that Rubio was implying that they do have evidence that she was involved in the occupation of buildings, which is illegal, although potentially a civil crime rather than a criminal crime. Do we want to be engaged in deporting people who did things like that? And I think that there's a lot of room there for discussion.
Do you so I wanna
Yeah. Well,
before
I
I'm
mean,
sure Zach
what
has a
do
lot of
well, let me ask one more. Let me ask one more thing, Liz, which is just on that question, because separating the legal from the moral question, I think, is what we're interested in doing here. They can battle the legal question out in the courts. What do you think of that moral question of we're clearly under national security pretenses going to target members of this specific protest movement?
Where I've come down on morally is that there are probably, conservative estimate, 2 billion people on planet Earth who would give their right arm for a green card to the United States. And we are depriving every single one of them of a limited resource because we've given it to somebody who has engaged in, if not material support, certainly symbolic support for an enemy of the United States. So to me, morally, I feel very comfortable about it. I really don't think this is about free speech at all. I don't think this slippery slope argument holds at all. They're clearly not going anywhere near American citizens. Like nobody really thinks that that's happening or that's going to happen. I think the distinction between citizen and non-citizen is fundamental to how this administration sees its domestic policy, its labor policy, and its foreign policy. So I feel very comfortable morally on this. If it turns out that this woman is being deported just on the grounds of the op-ed, that would be something that I would have to seriously consider because that is just speech. And as far as I recall, the op-ed itself was not clearly supportive of Hamas. It's not like Khalil, who has actually defended violence against civilians. It's a different situation. But from the way Rubio is talking about it, it seems pretty clear that there will be evidence presented that she participated in these, more criminal acts. But yes, you're right to give me
We'll
that
see.
skeptical look. And if they don't have that evidence, this will be a harder call.
The thing that I really have an issue with here is that I feel a little bit like the Trump administration has said the quiet part out loud, in that when they initially, basically started attempting to deport Mahmoud Khalil, they they told the Free Press, they told reporters at the Free Press that, he doesn't stand accused of breaking any law. And they pointed to his protest activity. Even when you were talking about his conduct, you described, after initially you described him handing out leaflets, Hamas propaganda leaflets, which, you know, again, that's an expressive act that's exposing people to evil ideas, but ideas nonetheless. And him engaging in other expressive acts, speech, protest acts, and I think that that's a really different thing than lying on his applications or failing to disclose his UNRWA work, which, it almost seems like the green card process should have been more thorough to attempt to weed that out earlier on, especially because there's pretty good public record of that, of his affiliations there. But I'm struggling a lot with the fact that the Trump administration basically initially made pretty clear that they're targeting him because of his speech, because of his position that he's taken, against Israel, and in support of Hamas. And then later on, they mentioned the justification, the actual legitimate justification of, well, he failed to disclose all of the information about his affiliations when he applied for this visa. What do you, as somebody who cares deeply about free speech, like, do you feel a little bit like they told us something about their intent that they really shouldn't have, and that we should kind of look into that and feel concerned about that?
I think I hear what you're saying, but I think you're saying they moved the goalpost because they got caught out on the free speech thing. I think that's your argument, right? And
Yeah, and I
I
think that, like, when
Mhm.
people show who they are, we ought to listen, and when the Trump administration shows that they don't actually give a damn about free speech, I'm interested in listening, because I think that we're beginning to see a pattern of behavior, and that concerns me more than just immigration enforcement would concern me.
I think, so Khalil's own lawyer, one of the people representing him, gave a seminar to the campus protesters in which she made it very clear that, citizens are allowed to distribute whatever they want. But if you are here on a green card or a visa, student visa, if you are not a citizen of the United States, you don't have those same rights. You should not say anything that could be interpreted as supporting Hamas. Because while the Supreme Court has upheld the free speech rights of non citizens, um, there is a limit to that when it comes to material support for terrorism. Now, I think that, we know that Hamas views the campus protests as, the kind of publicity you cannot buy for love or money. They showed footage of it to Israeli hostages while they were being kept hostage and said, look at what a good job these kids are doing in order to get our message out there. So to me, that kind of propaganda is very clearly material support. Now, I don't think it would rise to the level of material support for a US citizen. But I think that Khalil's own lawyers telling those students this is how this will be interpreted by the law, and that statute allows Marco Rubio to deport people who are considered a national security threat to our foreign policy. Not really just a threat, but a threat to our foreign policy. If they are actually helping the cause of terrorists, I feel like that is not in the rubric of a free speech question. It would be if it was an American citizen. But it's not when somebody has been granted the greatest privilege on planet Earth, which is to apply to become an American citizen, to have a test run to be an American citizen. At that point, the American people, through their elected officials, through the president's cabinet, have the right to say, sorry, of the 2 billion people who would really love to be our neighbor, you've proven that you do not believe in the values that this country was founded on. You don't believe that terrorism is evil. You believe that October 7th was something to be celebrated, which is something the organization that he represented, they literally put out a statement extolling the virtues of October 7th. So I don't think any American citizen should be, God forbid, have anything happen to them because of that. But when it comes to someone who is applying for that privilege, that enormous privilege, I think we're totally in our rights to say, actually, no, we're going to give it to somebody who actually shares our values. And, Liz, the best part about this is if the American people feel very strongly that that was a wrong call by Marco Rubio, they will have the opportunity to have their voices heard very soon. There's going to be election 2026, elections 2028, and they can vote for a government like the Biden administration that was very happy to let people in and not check whether they had once belonged to a terrorist organization before giving them a green card.
I think the thing that I'm struggling with, and I noticed it in what you were saying just a minute ago, is that this isn't happening at the stage of the government choosing whether or not they ought to grant or deny a visa. The problem that I have is that, in a sense, these green card holders, these permanent residents, these student visa holders, because some of their immigration statuses are different, in a sense, they've very much assimilated and really figured out what it means to be an American because they feel so comfortable exercising their speech rights. And yeah, that lawyer is providing, proper guidance of saying, hey, you are not a full citizen. Please tread carefully because you don't know what could happen to you. But I do think that there is a really important distinction to be made here. I would feel very differently about this case if this type of thing were being hashed out at the level of, we're doing investigation, discovery to figure out whether or not this person ought to be granted a green card. The fact that this is punitive, it feels like retribution, and it's happening after the green card has already been issued. That's where I begin to really have a problem. And I think that these distinctions, like on one hand, I imagine some viewers will feel like we're being incredibly nitpicky to be attempting to sift through the like rap sheet or not of, Rumeysa Öztürk, like people who really don't have very much influence or power. But at the same time, I actually do think these details make all of the difference because when I think about what type of people I want to let into this country, of course, I don't want Hamas supporters to be let into this country, but I do want people who believe our promises that are enshrined in the First Amendment. And I want our country to make good on those promises. And I want, people who feel comfortable engaging in political speech. I would prefer if it's not for the causes that I absolutely loathe with every fiber of my being. But, we don't get to be so picky sometimes, at least after we've already issued the green card. That's the thing I'm really struggling with here.
So I totally hear you. My response to that would be the way that I think Marco Rubio sees the retroactive nature is not that we are reneging on our promise, but that they lied on that application. Because if they had been honest that they are likely to engage in occupations of buildings and, support for Hamas, they would never have gotten it in the first place. So you're saying they engaged in free speech and are being punished for it. And he's saying, no, they lied and we are just correcting the record. So it's a different way of interpreting the retroactive nature of this.
I think one thing that I struggle with a little bit there is people can be sort of left in the immigration lurch for many, many years. And to some degree, I had one Twitter follower make this argument to me, and I actually really appreciate it. If we want our immigrants to assimilate to America, boy, is there nothing that looks more like assimilation than going to college and doing dumb, idiotic protests and beginning to hold really stupid beliefs. I think in the Mahmoud Khalil case, you can make the case that it's not that he was beginning to hold these beliefs. These aren't beliefs that he sort of adopted by nature of this being the vogue issue on college campuses. He's been steeped in this issue for a long time. And I think you can make a better case that he's sort of more of a threat or that we don't really know what types of affiliations he has. But I do think there is something kind of interesting where it's like, I want people to assimilate and I want them to engage in their First Amendment rights as they become Americans and as they go through that process of becoming more and more American. I feel so uncomfortable with the way that this has been handled, especially I think the Khalil case, perhaps there's a better case to be made for why he actually is more closely linked with Hamas. With the Rumeysa Öztürk case, I mean, do we have anything other than an op-ed? That's the thing that's really concerning to me. She's basically calling for like what, BDS of Israel? Like there's not something deeper that we've seen so far. And if the administration wants to galvanize public support for their crackdown, they really need to present actual evidence beyond a college newspaper op-ed. That just isn't good enough to me.
So
What do you
so,
think of that, Batya?
a couple things. The first is I don't think the administration is very worried about galvanizing support for this. Those campus protests were so deeply unpopular. Like, one of these 90-10 issues. I mean, even most Democrats were really disgusted with the imagery that came out of the college campus protests. The way that Jewish students were sort of harassed. It was really ugly. I didn't like the whole like Jews are being victimized on college campuses narrative. I didn't think the harassment was like that bad, but it was definitely morally offensive, if nothing else. Like, just gross, stopping people to demand to know if they're Zionists, not letting them get to class, the constant chanting for an intifada while Jewish students are trying to study. Like, it's gross. It's not like I don't think that they need to be rescued or saved or anything. I think it's a little bit of an insult to Jewish history to suggest that they were victimized by this. But it was sort of, there's something about it that was appalling. And I think that's how most Americans viewed it. And so I think the Trump administration is sort of betting on that. I mean, there have not been mass protests against this. And it comes back to your first point, which is what could be more American than joining a university and protesting. These protests only happened at the most elite universities. So the vast majority of American colleges, state schools, to say nothing of like, vocational schools, community colleges, nothing of the sort. This is
Yeah.
very elite.
It's an elite American value. It's not an
Yes,
experience shared
exactly.
by yeah,
Whereas
I
I think most Americans, when you talk to them, they feel what they want is for immigrants to feel grateful. Like, that's a very important thing. And you saw this a lot, I remember at the RNC. They had a whole bunch of people who were legal immigrants getting up and talking about, why illegal immigration is so offensive to them. And the theme that came up again and again and got like massive, massive applause was when they would talk about how unbelievably grateful they felt for the privilege of joining this country. And so to me, I think that the sort of average American looks at this and is like, you know what? Like, we don't need this. They're grossed out by the college protests. They're grossed out by the elite leftist radical like culture in general has a real brand problem right now, and they don't understand why are we even importing more people like that when there's so many, people in, South America, Central America, Ukraine, like people who share our values, who are desperate to come here, who are not getting a chance because of these people who are being dishonest on their visa applications.
I think to your point, you're totally right. And I feel like the Trump administration is taking a W and turning it into an L somehow, right? Like, you're totally correct that there's no like those Columbia protesters annoy the crap out of me and like so many other Americans. And so how frustrating that now I feel as though in order to be a free speech champion, a free speech advocate, I feel like I have to defend them a little bit, even though they're the last people I want to defend. I think that like it feels like the Trump administration could have just taken the W and instead they're trying to, use maximally punitive means of making this an issue that I think maybe allows people to sort of splinter off from supporting them and their actions to now feeling somewhat betrayed, I think.
So I think probably people felt that way at the beginning of the Mahmoud Khalil story and now probably feel less so about Mahmoud Khalil specifically. And I imagine there's going to be more like that. I'm not saying they're going to make no mistakes, but luckily we have an independent judiciary and each of these cases is going to go through the courts. Actually, Rubio said that they've done this to 300 students and there has been like zero backlash to most of them. We only found out about these two cases, which had a big backlash. Mahmoud Khalil turns out, I think, unjustly. I was wrong about that. More information came out that really justified it. And now with this other young woman who wrote the op-ed, it's possible that that's all she did. And then I'll come back here and say, look, I can't defend this. This is indefensible. I hope the courts shoot this down. I'm sure they will. But it's also possible more will come out, like in the case of Mahmoud Khalil, where at first everybody was like, this was such a mistake. They thought he had a visa. He's a green card holder. This is just more messiness from the administration, when it turned out actually, no, it's quite justified. So I think we'll see a lot more of that. But again, I am open to being wrong about that, especially in the case of this woman.
Yeah, I want to move us to something that JD Vance said on the campaign trail. So basically, he promised lots and lots of deportations, but not exactly the types of deportations that we're seeing. John, could you roll that ABC News clip?
If you're not willing to deport a lot of people, you're not willing to have a border when there are 20 million illegal aliens in our country.
10 to 15 million people, this is like, I mean...
Well, John, I think that's the wrong attitude to take of it. Okay,
so you go knock on doors and ask people for their papers.
Again, but let me finish. I think this is the wrong attitude towards it, right? There's 20 million people here illegally. You start with what's achievable. You do that. And then you go on to what's achievable from there. I think that if you deport a lot of violent criminals, and frankly, if you make it harder to hire illegal labor, which undercuts the wages of American workers, I think you go a lot of the way to solving the illegal immigration problem. But
So, Batya, he said he was going to start with the violent criminals. That's really not what's happened. We've seen an awful lot of people rounded up, and Trump has been claiming that there are Tren de Aragua members associated with gangs, but we're seeing a lot of reports coming out that it's just like innocent Latino dudes with tattoos. We've also seen deportations of an awful lot of students so far. What do you make of the disconnect between what Vance claimed the administration would do on the campaign trail and what we're actually seeing playing out?
Have they deported anyone who was not here illegally?
I don't know.
I
I
don't
think
think they have, and honestly, again, I think this is one of these issues where, like, you stop an average person on the street and say, like, I don't think people have a problem with people who entered the country illegally, which is a felony, being deported. I think, the thing that the Trump administration, I think, was wary of was sort of the imagery of, like, families, being rounded up, children being torn from their mother's arms. There was a quite funny moment where I forget who, a journalist asked Tom Homan, like, "Well, how are you going to avoid family separation? Is it possible to deport people without separating families?" And he was like, "Of course it is. You can deport the whole family." Like that's kind of how they see it. Is like if you came here illegally, you committed a felony. Now, yes, people have a right to claim asylum, but under the previous Trump administration, they had a remain in Mexico policy, which they've reinstated, where to claim asylum, you have to wait your turn. Because there are people all across the world who don't have $10,000 to pay to a terrorist cartel to get them here, who have actual legitimate asylum claims. You think it's easy being gay in Gaza? It's not. Like, there's a lot of people there like that who I think we should, like people waiting in desperate situations who don't want to be thrown off of a roof for being gay. And like, we're just allowing people to sort of, under the last administration, to flow across the border and wait here and disappear into the ether. So I think from the administration's point of view, if you are here illegally, you committed a crime. Now, does that mean that every person they've deported, like, is at the top of the line of the violent criminals, etc.? They probably have made or will make mistakes. That's every administration is going to make mistakes. But if you're asking me, is this the kind of mistake that's going to keep me up at night? It's really not. And I think that's true for most Americans. Immigration is a shorthand for the ways in which, under the guise of elite virtue, they sold out the working class. And people feel that very, very strongly and powerfully. And I think JD is right. You don't have to deport 15 million people. If you close that border, after corporations and Wall Street and all these employers have gotten used to getting this just steady stream of low wage illegal labor, that in and of itself, just limiting it right now to what we have, is going to have a major impact that the Trump administration is hoping, which is it will raise working class wages because you'll have a tighter labor market. Just that. The fact that they're getting rid of, violent criminals, I love it. I voted for it. They said during the campaign that they were going to deport every person who came here illegally over the last 4 years. That is what people voted for, and not just Republicans. A lot of Democrats voted for Trump based on that promise. So I don't think people are being kept up at night. Of course, if some, innocent person who has a legitimate asylum claim gets caught up in the shuffle, should they have the ability to apply for asylum from somewhere else that isn't a jail? Sure. But is this the thing that I'm sitting here like losing sleep over? It really isn't.
I mean, I think so. I think we agree on the facts. I think we come down differently as to what we believe asylum seekers ought to be entitled to. The thing that I'm struggling with is there are a lot of people, including some of the people who Trump has recently deported, who are maybe Venezuelans fleeing awful socialism from their home countries, who know that they cannot return safely, who did what the US government had formerly said they needed to do, which is to come and wait at a port of entry and make an asylum claim, and then you may be let into the country. This was before the Remain in Mexico policy was reinstated. And, under the Biden administration, you stay in this country and you await your court date. And yes, that's not ideal. And you and I are both New Yorkers, Batya. We don't like that a bunch of these people have been let in and then handed, debit cards by our local city government and basically been given, immense welfare to, clog up homeless shelters here and make it so that they stay here for a very, very long time. But the fact of the matter is a lot of people came to these ports of entries like they were told to do, and then they made their case for asylum, and then now they have a pending court date, and there's a backlog, and the courts are not processing this very quickly, and they're in the United States, and they're being, in many cases, taken to, like, this horrible Salvadoran prison where there legitimately are. I mean, this is like a Bukele, like, overrun with gang member type prison, and it's just not something that I mean, I voted for Trump as well. I feel like this isn't what I voted for, right? These innocent people or these peaceful people who were attempting to follow the process and do things the right way, where the goalposts sort of shifted, the administration changed, the policy changed, which yes, that's their prerogative to do. But now they're being deported in sort of the most maximally harsh, aggressive way to the most awful conditions. And it's unclear to me what exactly they were supposed to have done.
The last administration partnered with terrorist cartels as a jobs program to import cheap labor to fill American corporate jobs,
I mean,
corporations.
but there's an agency component here. Like a lot of like the people who came in, it wasn't like they were in many cases like kidnapped by the coyotes and brought across the border. They
No. Oh,
like they were seeking
I
a better
mean,
life here.
but that I wouldn't have even gone that far. I was gonna say they got had, but you're saying, no, they had agency. Sure, yeah, they did have agency, and they took advantage of a horrible, horrible, horrible administration and a horrible, horrible, horrible policy, and I feel sorry for them. I'm not gonna let my pity dictate what the correct policy should be right now. And the fact if they make a mistake here or there, they should correct it. Every administration makes mistakes, but the last administration had an absolutely disastrous, unbelievably cruel policy that in the name of kindness and compassion to these people, um, you know, a third of women who make the crossing through the Darien Gap admit to being raped. You can imagine what the real number is. Children get killed. Lots of people get killed. I mean, the unbelievable cruelty. They get a bracelet, and based on the color of the bracelet, that's how much money they owe the cartels. They are slaves when they get here. They are enslaved to the cartels to pay off a $10,000, $20,000 debt, 30,000 if you're coming from China. Like, this is slave. The last administration partnered with the cartels on slavery. Now, did nice people get caught up in that? I'm sure. People who wanted a better life for their families, of course. But to allow our compassion for them to dictate the correct policy for now, to me, seems like the kind of sociopathic compassion that liberals have when they don't have to pay for any of the consequences of their choices and their actions. This was unbelievably cruel to the migrants themselves. I totally agree with you. And it was unbelievably cruel to the American working class, whose wages were depleted based on the fact that they had all of this low wage illegal competition. Yeah, it sucks that the Biden administration did that. I don't think that that should determine whether or not the Trump administration should fix it. And I think in general, if you look at what Trump's kind of guiding principle is, whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy or economic policy, I think that he looks at what the Democrats stand for, which is like ostensibly some sort of compassion, whether it's expanding the welfare state or giving endlessly to Ukraine or supporting the Palestinians and effectively Hamas, or having an open border or having free trade. And, in the name of their compassion for everybody, in each of these cases, they have perpetuated unbelievable, unfathomable levels of cruelty. And I think what Trump says is, I don't care to be the bad guy to put an end to these policies that have engendered insane amounts of cruelty in the name of the compassion of the elites, their ability to see themselves as more compassionate than their poorer working class neighbors who just want the American dream for their family. So yeah, I can say I feel sorry for if there were mistakes made, I want them to correct them. Even if these guys were just illegally here, asylum seekers, whatever, they were lied to by the Biden administration or told one thing by the Biden administration. We, as a sovereign nation, have the right to correct the mistakes of the last administration, even if there were other people sort of caught up in them.
Yeah, I don't think that the two options have to be either a totally chaotic, sort of underground, inhumane situation as we saw under the Biden administration and frankly under the Trump administration that preceded the Biden administration, or sort of Trump's like Fortress America, we're going to seal all the borders and not let, be very sparing as to who we let in. We could have a policy where we make it easy for people who want to live and work here peacefully and contribute to our society to come here, and not, terrorize people over their visas because they hold the wrong political opinions, which is where I feel like we are now. I mean, when you say that this is some sort of attack on the working class, what is your evidence for that? We had fairly low unemployment. Like what are immigrants doing to degrade the existence of working class people in America?
All of the job gains pretty much of the last 5 years were of illegal immigrants. So the Department of Labor, the Bureau of Statistics, does not distinguish between, when it's looking at jobs numbers, between citizen or non-citizen. So we have millions of Americans who are out of work, who are just not being accounted for or counted for, especially young men. The degradation of masculinity, because we shipped good manufacturing jobs overseas to China and Mexico to build up their middle class, jobs that relied on brawn and physicality. And then we imported millions and millions of people to work in janitorial services, construction, landscaping. These jobs are now impossible for an American to feed their family on. And I go into this at great length in my book, Second Class. The view both on the left and on the libertarian right is that, well, nobody wants to clean toilets. What's the problem with, bringing in desperate Venezuelans from failed socialist states to clean toilets? Nobody wants to do that. It's so freaking insulting. The majority of people working in every single industry in America are citizens, including janitorial services. Every single one of those jobs, including agriculture, by the way, is being done by a majority of our fellow citizens, and people sit around saying, "Well, nobody would wanna do that job." It's disgusting. Millions of Americans get dignity out of doing those jobs. They just can't feed a family on them because of the open border policies, which flooded these 5 or 6 industries with low-wage labor, and it's amazing because even government contracts can get away with this because they just subcontract out. And so you have a black guy in California trying to run a business by, a janitorial business, trying to pay his workers a living wage, and he's competing with teams that are staffed entirely by people who got here 2 years ago, who are willing to work for $7, $8 an hour. It's horrifying. And of course, the argument that is made by free market people and open borders people, libertarian people, is that, well, if you look at the GDP, mass migration has resulted in the GDP going up. And this is 100% accurate. It has resulted in the GDP going up. The thing that they never point out is that GDP is not equally distributed. And if you look over the last 50 years, all of those gains have gone to the top 10%, which now controls over 60% of the GDP. And meanwhile, working class people, middle class people, that used to be the biggest chunk of the GDP. It's no longer. So you had this squeeze through mass migration and obviously other things, offshoring, globalization, a little bit of automation, less than people say. It squeezed people like us up to the top, and it squeezed working class people down into the bottom and deprived them of a middle class life. And this is obvious to working class people. They look at their parents and they can tell their parents, worked in the factory and retired, at 60 and owned their home and had a pool and a truck and go on vacations twice a year, and they know that they are working 3 jobs now and they will never own a home. They can't afford a single vacation, and they can barely afford to buy the stuff that they need in the supermarket. So it is very obvious if you like get out of like our circles, you talk to people who are not in the knowledge industry, and it was through very intentional policy. You had NAFTA. I, by the way, support a lot of the Reagan era deregulation. I think that Trump has sort of arrived at this kind of almost Reaganite formula where on the one hand, you're very pro-business. So you're slashing corporate taxes, you're slashing taxes for people at the top, you're getting rid of regulation so that you're encouraging business, you're making people want to invest, but then also you're controlling the border, limiting the supply of labor, and getting rid of the free trade so that the products of the labor of the working class is competitive again. That is like the patriotic model. It's like neither side like really realized this, I think. So you had NAFTA, then you had the defunding of vocational training by Obama, and then, just both parties, just like an endless appetite for low wage competition from illegal migrants.
I'm a big proponent of some of the things that I think are policy decisions that we could make that would serve what you're talking about, a reinvigoration of the middle class, for example. Like, in many cases, we have extremely bloated college tuition rates. And for some jobs, a 4-year degree is still required. Attempting to slash those requirements, allowing people alternatives, and pursuing more trade schools. That those would all be wonderful things that we could pursue. I do want to just like lodge a factual error because this is something that and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says a lot, and it drives me absolutely crazy. And I noticed that you said it just now. The actual percentage of like the employed American population that's working multiple jobs, what is it? Like off the top of your head, like what would you guess it is? Not even 3 jobs, but like 2 jobs, multiple jobs of any sort. What would you guess, Batya?
Oh, I have no idea.
It's 5% of the population. Of course, that statistic, a
Well,
BLS
is that's
statistic,
that's
might
that's
not
who
capture everything,
but
right?
that's who's,
Yeah.
like, admitting to it or who's, like, on the
Yeah,
books doing it.
there could very well be a situation where a mom is a fast food worker during the day and logs, 40, 50 hours a week doing that, and then also does some childcare work, under the table, and so maybe she isn't reporting that employment, like, that doesn't end up being captured by this statistic. But I actually this is something that does kind of bother me a little bit, right? Like, the actual percentage of Americans if Americans were by and large, even like lower and middle class Americans working 2 or 3 jobs to scrape by, and this were like a routine thing that vast numbers are doing, I think we would know about that. I think that some more of that would be captured by the BLS
Oh,
data.
well,
5% is a very low number. That's
I
about 9
think
million Americans.
if you think about, like, what kinds of jobs people are doing as second jobs, whether it's elder care, childcare,
Really a lot of
whether it's
industry
whether
things.
it's cleaning, whether it's door dashing, whether like, a lot of these jobs are not jobs that would show up or that people would even report, and, of course, they don't wanna admit it because then they would have to pay taxes on, like, whatever meager earnings they're making, but, I like, when I was reporting my book, most people had a second thing, like, if only just to and, it's not statistically significant, but I spoke to hundreds of people, and if only just to cover those basics. So, yeah, I totally agree with you. I'm sure it's not represented in the data.
So
Yeah, I mean, I want to expand our conversation of the economy in a little bit. I will say that it's hard to have a conversation when you're like, well, there's all these secret statistics that are not that are not reflecting like unemployment, for instance, is a pretty strong indicator, and it ebbs, and immigration ebbs and flows in concert with it. So when we have higher unemployment, fewer immigrants tend to come over. We saw this during the recession under the Obama administration, that people kind of just stopped coming over from Mexico because there were no jobs. I mean, I want to dig a little bit more into the economics later, but I don't want to let go the other aspect of deportations that is bothering me, that I wonder what you think about, which is just the kind of expansion of lawless action, or expanding what it is that the state is allowed to target people over, whether it's these campus cases we've been talking about, where now we're suddenly saying that engaging in protest is equivalent to like material support of a terrorist group. You could imagine how that turns into
I
like a
didn't say that.
complete
Are you
civil.
saying
Okay.
that I said that? I didn't say that. I didn't make that argument.
You
I
were
mean,
saying
maybe you're
that,
talking about other people, but I
okay.
was saying that
So you don't
Hamas
believe that Khalil or Ozturk were materially supporting Hamas.
I'm saying that Hamas considered the propaganda that they got out of the campus protests to be material support. Now, does that mean
Okay.
that I think an American citizen should be prosecuted for that? Definitely not. But does that mean that I think that when we're looking at what Khalil did, should we consider the fact that Hamas considers itself to have gotten material support out of his actions? Of course, that's a legitimate thing to consider in terms of whether this person is a security threat to our national interests.
But the reason that it matters is because this is the justification that the government is using to go after them. They're
No, it's actually
saying they're
not.
providing material support.
No, they haven't made that argument. They've actually argued that they don't need to make that argument. Like Marco Rubio is pointing to this statute and saying, I can deport anybody on a green card who I want to, who I consider to be a threat to our national security and our foreign policy interests. So he has not made that argument. And in fact, in the beginning, everyone was saying, well, I was saying too, well, I'll totally support this if Khalil, if he's accused of doing a crime. And Rubio kept saying, I don't actually have to show that. And he's right. Legally, he does not have to show that they committed any crimes. Now, it happens to be that the terrorist organization under consideration considers them to have produced for them, immensely profitable propaganda. Now, we can debate, like, does propaganda is it considered material support? Well, if somebody would have paid
Yeah.
for something, it's material, right? If somebody would have, given the opportunity, paid for a service like a propaganda service or a PR service, right? We would consider that a material object. Now, again, I think there's
Yeah.
limits to this because there is free speech when it comes to American citizens. But when we're considering somebody who is applying, who is asking us to make them a citizen, I think that that is a totally legitimate reason to say, actually not, we're going to go with the people who didn't give Hamas like free propaganda.
I just think it's a dangerous path to go down, whether it starts with visa holders or green card holders or not, because we're talking about, I mean, we just lived through the kind of Russiagate paranoia where it's like, are these commentators providing material support to the Russian? Like, you could see it very easily being expanded. So I'm nervous about that sort of framing, and any of us like giving that any sort of legitimacy. And then also there's these deportations of violent Venezuelan gang members to the El Salvador prison, or alleged gang members, because again, now there's some stories trickling out of this gentleman who's a hairdresser who apparently the ACLU is representing him and saying that he was targeted because he had a tattoo of a crown over his mom's name, and that like somewhat represents, or that somewhat resembles, a gang tattoo. Wouldn't We don't know for sure what's going on there yet. Wouldn't be completely shocking to me given the way Bukele has prosecuted his war on the gangs in El Salvador. They don't seem to be particularly careful about what sort of tattoos they're using to profile people. But I want to talk about that issue specifically. We've got a clip of the kind of propaganda video that Bukele put out showing the deportees being frog marched into his prison. John, could you roll that? Okay, and then of course, a judge ordered that these flights return to the U.S. And Bukele's response was to say that it was too late, and then He has kind of jumped into our discourse and said the U.S. is facing a judicial coup. You know,
I didn't see
what
this.
do you make of the sort of what do you make of the Bukele Trump partnership?
Um, I have to say, like, I just love seeing these world leaders on their knees begging Trump for a scrap of approval. I just like, as an American, that just makes me feel great, and like my interests are being represented. I just love that, and I don't know, you don't love that? You don't love seeing these world leaders on their knees begging Trump to, make it stop or make it go well for them, and him just being like, "Well, I'll consider it. We're gonna see what's in the interest of our people." Like, it's so weird because for so long, we were everybody's patsies. We're paying for this and we're paying for that, and people are laughing at us, like, and I it's just such a cool, like, it's so wild. It makes me feel very safe to know that the world is shaking because our interests are gonna come first for the first time in, like, certainly 20 years, 30 years.
I guess what I don't like and don't think is cool is sort of holding hands with the strongmen in El Salvador to sort of skirt around due process so you can just send all your problems to an El Salvadorian prison. That seems potentially dangerous and not cool.
Well, I don't see Trump tweeting anything, in return. This is it seems to me fairly one-sided. I don't know. Those guys are like they're yeah, the hairdresser, I'm waiting to see, like, if they have an excuse for it, and if not, if they're gonna bring him back. That seems like it could potentially be a huge mistake, and I'll see gonna wait and see how sorry, I don't trust the ACLU, like, but we'll see how that turns out. But these guys are like, do you know what they do to women? Like, these guys are just just the most vile, violent. If you go on Reddit and look for videos of what they dismember women while they are alive. Like, what they do to
Yeah,
humans, these are not, to me, like, these people are barely human, and to see them humiliated, like, if, the vast majority of them, I think probably we would agree, are violent, vile terrorist criminals who brought fentanyl
I've
into our
got no
country,
problem.
who
Yeah, look,
traffic
I've got no
people into our
problem with.
country.
Yeah, look, I have no problem with folks like that being humiliated. It's the people who get caught up in the net. Like, we are not a sort of Central American banana republic. Like, we should have due process. We should have we shouldn't be just sweeping people up into this dragnet and then going, well, it's just a handful who are getting
No,
deprived of their rights and
I
thrown
agree with
into a
that. I
prison
agree
in
with that,
Central
but
America. Yeah.
there's no evidence so far that Trump has defied a single judge's order. The plane had already taken off, and the question was whether the judge had the authority to return it, and I don't think that they do. I
Mhm.
think that there is some judicial overreach, but at this point, Trump has not yet defied a single judge's order, and he has said repeatedly that he intends not to. He intends to fight it out in the court. He thinks he's right, but they have not yet defied anything. So
Do do we actually know? Like, do we actually I guess I realize that with that specific case, I don't know the specific time that the, wheels lifted off of American ground, right? Like, I would not be shocked if it was, Trump giving the signal, "Hurry up and go, 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 because we just got the order because the federal judge said absolutely not and block this," right? Like, we don't do we actually know? That's a
Well,
legitimate
but
question.
that's not their narrative, right? At least, like, everybody's saying that they're saying they don't need to listen to the judges. That's not true. They are saying we intend to listen to the judges. In this case, the plane had already taken off, right? So you would be right. Like,
But what I'm
maybe
saying
they're
is,
lying.
are they
You're
telling
saying
the
maybe
truth
they're
about
lying.
whether the
Right, right.
plane
And
had
I'm
already
I'm
taken off?
saying it matters that if they're not telling the truth, it matters that they chose to lie about it because the signal it sends
Mm.
is we have
Yes.
no intention to defy these
Yeah,
judges.
because they're attempting yeah, well, so, I mean, I feel like this week, honestly, will be the test of this, right? Because on Friday, they filed that motion before the Supreme Court, basically asking the Supreme Court to take up this case, and saying that this is an urgent issue and that we need to be considering, the mechanism by which this is done. I mean, this week, honestly, will kind of be a huge test, and we'll get to begin to see how this dynamic plays out between a fairly conservative Supreme Court and the Trump administration. I think so far the Supreme Court has been pretty reluctant to get too deep in here, and they've in fact chosen to decline to hear a bunch of cases related to this conduct. So, I mean, I guess we'll know really soon. But how do you think the Supreme Court should behave here? And are you worried that the Trump administration will, in fact, do their actions so far strike you? Obviously, you have no, crystal ball and you can't forecast the future. But are you worried about an administration that ignores judicial limits?
No. Trump has never defied a judge's order, despite, I'm sure we would agree, a lot of really terrible judge's orders vis-a-vis him and about him, and so I don't think that they are interested in a constitutional crisis at all, but I
What
could
about
be
the
wrong.
calls to impeach that judge, though? I mean, to me, that got dangerously close between the third
Yep.
term talking that was leading the news this morning. We're recording this on Monday, March 31st. And then I think more importantly, Trump calling for the impeachment of a judge that
Yeah,
attempted the very
Trump
judge
Trump
that we're talking about
I
here.
think
Like,
Trump
that's
totally rejects the idea that his First Amendment rights should be abridged by the power he wields. That's a fundamental about Trump. He has never, ever felt that he should not be able to say exactly what he thinks. Now, I
but
think
the
we
president calling for a judge to be impeached
so
is, I mean,
I could see that argument.
he's
I
not
think
saying the
he
judge is an asshole, which I would be like, yes, First Amendment, good
right.
job,
So
Trump, do
he
it.
fundamentally believes that his First Amendment right should never be abridged, even given the power that he currently wields, and that's something that I think is fair, fair games for debate.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Hmm.
Zach, did you have one more follow up here?
Yeah, I mean, the other component of this is that it's all being done under the auspices of the Alien Enemies Act, which I can pull up here and just read a bit of the text. Uh, Whenever there's a declared war between the United States and any foreign nation or government, or in any invasion or predatory incursion by any foreign nation or government, subjects of the hostile nation or government being of the age 14 years upwards, who shall be within the United States and not actually naturalized, shall be liable to be apprehended, restrained, secured, or removed as alien enemies. As far as I know, we're not in a war with any of these nations or facing an invasion from a foreign power. So again, are you troubled by the kind of wielding of these national security powers to carry out some sort of other agenda?
I am at war with Nicaragua. I am at war with them. I am, and they have the
You've
power of a
declared
state.
war.
I have to I am declaring
Hmm.
personal war on them. I mean, I think
Yeah.
Trump has very much sees this as an invasion. They are a terrorist organization that wields the equivalent of state power in some narco states south of our border, and I think that they're fair game. I'm not bothered by this.
Can I ask a heretical question, actually? My own ignorance might be showing, but I actually just wanna, fully, I just wanna go here. What exactly, within our borders, if they are this foreign terrorist organization and if they are invading, like, what exactly I live in New York. I'm pretty exposed to, the sort of unsavory immigrant communities, of the world. There are some very good ones and very productive and helpful. Um, but basically New York is a place where you see kind of the best of the best and the worst of the worst. If Tren de Aragua is invading to the degree that it is claimed, why am I burying my head in the sand and ignoring some sort of, mass crime wave that's specifically attributable to them? Are the women of New York being, seized off of the streets and beheaded by this violent gang? Why don't I know about this if it's happening to the extent that Rubio and the Trump administration are claiming? And that's a legitimate question. Batya, is there stuff that, I just don't know, or the news isn't covering, or paint me a picture of the scale here?
Well, 90,000 Americans died of fentanyl overdoses, which was trafficked into our country by them. So that's, if that was an attack that happened on one day or over 3 months, we would consider that to be an act of war.
But
Every
very
restaurant,
but that's a very
every
specific thing
single
to specifically attribute to them, and there's also, again, there's this question of agency, right? Fentanyl hits those who consume fentanyl, those who shoot up, right? Those
Um,
who
every restaurant
rectify is tainted.
you have eaten in, every hotel you have stayed in has had slave laborers who pay back to them, who are enslaved in our country. There is slavery in America, which I consider to be unacceptable, and also literally theft from our fellow Americans. Yeah, they're not. I mean, there is crime. There is a lot of crime. There are a lot of illegal migrant women being raped, even as we speak right now. The domestic violence in these communities is off the charts. I know I sat in immigration court for 3 months once. But so yes, that is happening. But it's honestly like they don't even have to, like, I'm sure that the majority of their efforts are in trafficking humans and not in trafficking drugs because it is so much more lucrative for them. And the Biden administration legalized it. They literally partnered with these people. They created an app for them. So like, yeah, maybe you're not seeing it as like crime, although most of these people don't come, they if you're an illegal migrant woman and you get beat up by your boyfriend who's a gang member, you're not going to call the cops. So there is rampant crime happening, but they've also embedded themselves in our economy, which, like, would be considered like cause of war, under many other circumstances. Blocking a trade route is a legitimate cause of war. I mean,
Do
I'm
you have
speaking
a
a
sense of
little
how
bit
many
metaphorically here, but
do
sorry.
you have a sense of, like, rough numbers? Like, how many Tren de Aragua members could we roughly estimate are in our country right now, or in New York City specifically, or do
I
we
don't
have
know how many gang members there are, but I know that they have trafficked 15 million people here over the last 4 years. Every person who passed through the Darien Gap had to have a bracelet from one of these cartels, whether it's Tren de Aragua or one of the other ones. So, like, they have millions of slaves who are accountable to them, who they are holding their families hostage, back home, like, just totally accountable to them. Like that. I mean, it's insane. Like the level of organization here, which was state sponsored by our state. It's just like unfathomable. And it's totally amazing that there's some effort now to reverse that.
Hmm.
I want to pull up a clip of you on Bill Maher's show because it went big recently, and it's a great clip of you just laying out what you call the MAGA left. I don't know, the MAGA left agenda and sort of your defense of Trump's economic agenda. Let's roll that and talk about it to close out this
There was some
conversation.
tension. I loved the tension between you and Mar. It's good.
I was never a Republican or a conservative. I was a leftist, and I am still a leftist. I'm just a MAGA leftist now because
That makes no sense.
would you like me to explain it to you?
Please do. Yes, please.
When I look at what President Trump ran on and the agenda that he's enacting right now, he took a Republican Party that was built on social conservatism, foreign interventions and wars, and free trade and free markets. And he basically took an axe to all of those. During the campaign, he said, look, I mean, he's pretty pro-gay. That's pretty obvious. He appointed the highest-ranking out gay person, Scott Bessent, our Secretary of Treasury, which is incredible. And he sidelined the pro-life wing of his party.
He has changed the party, for sure.
Okay, so he believes abortion should be legal for 12 weeks.
But free trade, you mentioned.
On foreign intervention, he's anti-war. He's trying to bring to an end to all of these wars, okay?
By surrendering, but yes.
Okay.
I mean, that is one way to end the war.
Well, he's on the other side of another party that is quite pro-war and wants to keep the war going, right?
But let me just get
to the third point. And the third point is, and he's not free trade. He does not believe in free trade. He looked at our destroyed manufacturing base. He looked at the downwardly mobile working class. He looked at the fact that working class Americans can no longer afford the American dream. And he looked at why that was, which was there was a handshake agreement between both parties that we should somehow have free trade, which resulted in shipping 5 million good manufacturing jobs overseas to build up China and Mexico.
And some came here.
No, what they did was they brought in millions and millions of illegal migrants to compete with the jobs that remained here. And what Donald Trump said was, we have to stop selling out the working class. That agenda that he laid out, socially moderate, anti-war, and anti-free trade protectionist, that is a leftist
Sam, I will
agenda.
bring you in.
So I actually agree with you that it is a leftist agenda, and I think it's bad. And I'm just wondering, what is your reaction to how things have been going in terms of the tariffs, for instance? It seems to have really shaken up the stock market. There's a lot of public anxiety, according to polling, about where things are headed with the economy. Are you still confident, given how things have shaken out since then, that this is the right path for MAGA to be pursuing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, rich people are angry because they're supposed to be, because Trump is waging class warfare on behalf of the working class. Wall Street for the last 3 election cycles chose the Democrats. Like, that's not an accident. They hate what Trump represents. They love open borders. They love slaves. They love free trade, and they don't give a
Okay.
shit about the American working
Okay,
class.
but the stock market is more than rich people. It's like it's a reflection of the entire economy. It's a
60% of
signal
Americans
that
have stocks in their
they're
portfolio.
nervous that
Yeah, but Wall
that
Street is
things are
punishing Trump.
that
They're
their inputs
punishing
are going
him
to get more
for
expensive. Okay,
they're very obviously, very
they're
clearly, and
punishing
even
him.
yeah, I mean, and even if you talk to people like, who know, like, the business leaders, like, these negative forecasts, like, all of this, like, really bearish forecasting or what have you, like, that's because they hate the agenda. The agenda is going to put money in the pockets of working class people. I don't think anybody even disputes that, that you bring back he has already attracted over $1.2 trillion dollars of investment in the United States based on the threats of tariffs. I mean, $1 trillion of people promising to reshore manufacturing. I'm not talking about just random investment, promising to build factories. Like, everybody agrees that NAFTA resulted in huge, huge devastation in the Rust Belt. Like, we all agree on what the problem was. And you have somebody showing up and saying, actually, we can fix this. And everyone's like, no, 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 we can't fix it. We have to just accept it. The thing is that the manufacturing did not go the way of the horse and buggy. People are still doing the manufacturing. They're just doing it in other countries for slave wages. And tariffs is how you correct for that. And so I think it's doing really well. I think there might be a small recession, there might be a pullback, but we're due for some quantitative easing. I mean, the market has been very super inflated for a long time. And honestly, I think the polling reflects this, by the way. American Compass has some great polling on this. 77% of GOP voters said that they would accept, small hikes in prices if it resulted in better wages for them or their community or their fellow workers and fellow Americans. And the truth of the matter is that I think from the Trump administration's point of view, from a left-wing point of view as well, you just can't like cheap goods your way to the American dream. The American dream is it's a very clear concept. It's the idea that you should be able to own a home, retire in dignity. Your children should have the same amount of choices as you do, and you should have access to good health care. All of those things, the price of all of those things has skyrocketed by thousands of percents. So while working class people are making 1 or 2, percentage more than they made in the 70s, they cannot afford the most modest version of the American dream. And Trump is really trying to restore that.
Okay, yeah, I want to interrogate that because that's really the base of your claim as to why we need to reshore manufacturing jobs and that the middle class has been hollowed out. This idea that certain goods have gotten cheaper, but essential goods have gotten more expensive, and you are exactly right about that. I'm going to pull up some data to validate you here, Batya. This is these are the wages. Is this showing up? There we go. This is purchasing power held constant since 1964. As you can see, fairly flat. And so that's kind of what you're talking about in terms of flat wages since the 70s. This is the diversion, this is where the prices diverge between certain goods. You see things like cars, clothing, cell phones, computers, toys, TVs. All that has gone down. Um, Hospital services, college tuition, college textbooks, childcare, housing. That stuff has not gone down over the years. So people are working. You have to work fewer hours to get a lot of household goods, but for some of these essentials like housing or education, hasn't improved. My question is is it really tariffs and immigration that is causing this, or the alternative explanation that libertarians, the people who made that chart at AEI, tend to noticed is that it's the highly regulated goods, the goods that have a lot of government involvement, but healthcare, housing with zoning, and education with licensing, that there's a different culprit. It's not low skill immigration or overseas manufacturing that's causing this diversion, and that if you could, you know, remove the barriers and make housing more affordable, and as Liz was alluding to earlier, make education less costly or maybe even less necessary for certain jobs, that would be a way to do this and sort of grow the pie for everybody.
I'll make it quick because I know we have to go, but I totally support all of that. I think regulation in all these industries is disastrous. In fact, there's only one one industry that I support a completely open border for, and it's doctors. I think we should just flood the zone with doctors, get rid of all the hospital administrators. If we had, 600% more doctors, they would be able to compete in the marketplace and people would get better access to better healthcare. So yeah, I'm open borders when it comes to like, over credentialed elites, I will say, I think that the reason I think that manufacturing and immigration are also extremely important to this is because people in the knowledge industry who make good wages are able to afford all of these things. The market has simply regulated itself to the price that the top 10% can afford. And that's the real problem here is like, we in the knowledge industry, the over-credentialed elites have become not just the prime consumer, but the only consumer. Everything is made for us. Every freaking TV show and movie is made for us. Like you can tell by the jobs that people have and the discourse and everything like that, their resumes, the healthcare industry, it's still an industry. It is setting prices at a market rate, but that market rate is what people like us can afford. Same thing with houses. Like people are buying those houses, but they're in that top 20%, 10% that controls over 60% of the GDP. So that's why I think we have to fundamentally use the free market within this country to redistribute so that things are fairer, so that the people who work in our homes and work for us and work much harder than us can have access to the things that we take for granted. Because the market is working. It's just working for only a very small oligarchy effectively and not for everybody else.
I really object to the oligarchy framing. I mean, just to put some statistics to it, 62% of Americans own stock. So when we're talking about the Trump tariffs being really detrimental to the economy overall, we're not just talking about fat cats on Wall Street and in finance. We're talking about, Americans who have chosen to invest
But does that
in the
distinguish
stock.
Liz, does that
Well,
distinguish people whose, like, retirement fund is invested from people with
I would
personal
imagine I
stocks?
would imagine it includes all of them,
Why
but
wouldn't why wouldn't
62%
you
of
include
people.
that?
Yeah, but regardless, I just wanna keep going here. 62% of people, I mean, will be negatively impacted by this, in some way if they choose to sell now or if they want to liquidate in any way. 65% of Americans own their own homes. About 69% of the boomer generation owns their own home. So about 30% of boomers remain renters. So when thinking about people, because I totally agree with you in terms of the objective here, it's for people to have dignified living, dignified retirement. So I'm considering, okay, the chunk of the population that's retiring, okay, are they living in squalor? No. I mean, the vast majority of them, I think it's a total the two things come to mind here. One, I think the way you're painting it as like there's this oligarchy and they live these very rich, good, posh, secure lives. And then there's all the rest. I don't think that that's quite true. I think that you are correct in that there's a disappearing middle class, and we're seeing American society become more bifurcated, with more people moving from the middle class up into the upper class. But then also, by the same token, some losers in the like, not losers as in their personal qualities, but some people who lose out
My
in the
God.
middle class and sort of become, unable to find dignified work. And so we see an upper class and a lower class in this shriveling of the middle class, which is concerning. But I think it's worth pointing out that it's not just that they're all being brought down to the lowest rung. There's also a lot being moved into the upper rung. But I just think we wouldn't have a situation where 65% of the American public are homeowners. That's not an oligarchy. That's the vast majority. And then the other thing that I would just throw out there is that I think that it is perhaps fair to say that our old, maybe 1950s, very starry eyed notion of what the American dream is perhaps overdue for an update. And I say that not in that the update should be that we should have infinite streaming services and Amazon one day shipping, cheap consumer goods to our doors, and that that's what a dignified existence is. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying instead is that perhaps the expectation that home ownership ought to be the sort of main vehicle for generating wealth and being able to pass on wealth is just maybe a little bit of an outdated notion. We have a lot of issues where building has been really constrained. We have a lot of issues with lack of starter homes, which is really due to sort of this regulatory tightening post-Great Recession. We have a big issue with missing middle housing. It's really easy to find two-bedroom apartments in big cities. It's really hard to find three bedrooms. So what happens if you want to grow a larger family in some of these places? And then we do see in these coastal elite corridors, extreme out of control cost of living. San Francisco is not a tenable place for a working class person to live. New York, LA, no. But we do see other parts of the country where they really actually have alleviated some of these housing and cost of living issues, where people really can afford to live dignified existences. And I think the statistics really back me up here. It's not just this tiny little sliver of America that has access to a good life. What do you say, Batya?
So I totally disagree with all of that, but I know like we're running short on time.
You'll
I
give
will
me
just say
2-minute rebuttal.
I'll
I'll
do a
make time
very
for you.
2 minute rebuttal is that
Yeah, you have the final word here.
final word is that like in much of red America, the American dream is still alive because of the cost of housing. So you can be really poor in West Virginia and own a home. That does not mean that you have access to the other parts of the puzzle, to adequate healthcare. There's like a real problem in rural communities accessing healthcare, to
I
a
agree
retirement,
with you there
to good
completely.
wages, right? So yes, you can be quite poor in many places in America and become a homeowner. The question is, what else do you have access to in the places where there's a lot of opportunity? As you mentioned, the coasts, housing is unaffordable probably to most of us as well. And the problem with that is, yes, regulation, but mostly it's the NIMBYism of these couples. And Elizabeth Warren wrote a book about this called The Two Income Trap back when she was a Republican, in which she accurately pointed out what I was saying before, which is that the market has regulated itself to couples where both of them are in the knowledge industry and they have a combined income of $500,000 to $1 million a year. So basically, it used to be doctors married nurses, and lawyers married secretaries, and now doctors marry doctors and lawyers marry lawyers, and they all live in these coastal areas. And then the people that work for them just have no hope of competing with them in the marketplace for homes and for goods and services. So I think you're right. It's more complicated, but it's more complicated in the direction of oligarchy. I have to say, thank you guys so much for having me. Like, it's such a pleasure to be and an honor to be invited in somewhere where I know people see things differently and to have such a beautiful, delicious, respectful discussion. I'm so grateful to you both. Thank you so
Aw.
much for this.
We have one final question of
Well,
the show that
Yes.
Zach's going to ask, but I mean, obviously this isn't like your main point, but I like the idea that like the American dream, the way to reinvigorate it is like to sleep with your secretary more, right? Like that's like one lens because you're like, oh,
Yes.
they marry each other now, and I'm like, wait a second, is that the
yeah.
takeaway here, Batya?
This is how we
No,
make America
Let
great
me let
again.
me put it like
But
this. It's not the takeaway.
I mean, people, the sexes do need to interact more, We're talking about
no,
lack of marriage and that. No,
yeah.
thank you, Batya. We really appreciate it. We're gonna ask you the final question of the show. Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, we asked this of everyone, and I want to just reflect back to you that we really appreciate you coming on here and engaging in good faith, even though you knew there was going to be some tension and disagreement. So our final question of the show that we ask everyone is, what is a question that you think more people should be asking?
A question I think more people should be asking is, um, why do the people who don't agree with me think what they do?
Mm,
And how can I use love in order to understand them better? And then in order to convince them if I feel that it is still necessary after having understood them.
that's beautiful. Batya, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks,
Thank you
Batya.
so much for having me, guys. Seriously.
Thanks for listening to Just Asking Questions. If you want to support the show and help it grow, please like and share this episode. Leave a comment letting us know what you think, and if you have questions you'd like us to answer or any suggestions, you can email us at justaskingquestions@reason.com. See you next time.